The encounter at 30,000 feet. The soft hum of the private jet's engines reverberated through the luxurious cabin as Alina Parker adjusted her silk scarf, a delicate splash of color against her tailored navy suit. Everything about her radiated precision and control, from the sharp lines of her attire to the cold efficiency of her gaze. As the vice president of a multinational real estate empire, Alina was used to commanding every room she entered, or, in this case, every flight. The cabin, with its muted tones of cream and gray, boasted an air of exclusivity. Polished wood accents gleamed under the soft lighting, and the scent of citrus and leather hinted at meticulous attention to detail. Every element screamed luxury. The passengers, too, were carefully curated, a mix of executives, elite entrepreneurs, and influencers whose time was deemed too precious for commercial flights. Alina strolled down the aisle, her black stilettos clicking against the gleaming floor. The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional yet warm smile, intercepted her. "Miss Parker, welcome aboard. Your seat is 2A," the attendant said, gesturing toward an oversized leather seat. Alina nodded curtly and stepped toward her assigned spot. As she reached her row, her confident stride faltered for a brief moment. Her seatmate was already settled in 2B, a tall, casually dressed man with skin the color of rich mahogany. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to Alina's rigid demeanor. He glanced up briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to the book he was reading. Alina frowned, her eyes narrowing as she addressed the flight attendant, her voice clipped. "There must be some mistake. I wasn't informed I'd have company." The attendant hesitated. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss Parker. This flight is fully booked, and all seats are assigned. Mr. Carter is your seatmate for this journey." Alina's expression hardened. "That's unacceptable. I paid for privacy. This isn't the standard I expect." The murmurs of other passengers filled the cabin as the scene unfolded. The man in 2B, now identified as Mr. Carter, closed his book slowly and looked at Alina. His gaze was calm but steady, with a hint of curiosity. "I assure you, Miss Parker, I'll be as unobtrusive as possible," he said, his voice deep and measured. Alina ignored him and turned back to the attendant. "Move him, or move me." The attendant's polished smile faltered. "I'm very sorry, but that isn't an option. We're truly at capacity." Alina exhaled sharply, her displeasure evident. "Fine, but I expect not to be disturbed." The attendant nodded apologetically and retreated. Alina sank into her seat, her movements rigid, and retrieved her tablet from her designer handbag. The tension between her and Mr. Carter hung in the air, a palpable weight that drew the occasional glance from other passengers. As the jet began to taxi down the runway, Alina couldn't resist a pointed comment, muttered just loud enough to be heard. "You'd think there'd be better screening for passengers on flights like these." Mr. Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the window, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. When he finally spoke, his tone was even, almost amused. "Screening, you say? Interesting choice of words." Alina shot him a sharp look but said nothing. She focused on her tablet, scrolling through emails with practiced efficiency. The flight attendant returned moments later with a glass of champagne, placing it on Alina's tray table. "Here you are, Miss Parker," the attendant said. Alina didn't bother to thank her, merely lifting the glass and taking a sip. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Mr. Carter watching her, though his expression was unreadable. The flight settled into a rhythm as the jet climbed to cruising altitude. The attendant dimmed the cabin lights, and the other passengers busied themselves with work, movies, or quiet conversations. Alina, however, found it impossible to focus. She could feel Mr. Carter's presence beside her, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the irritation simmering within her. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you always travel this casually?" Mr. Carter turned to her, his dark eyes steady. "Excuse me." She gestured toward his outfit. This is a private flight. One would expect a certain level of decorum. He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. I didn't realize there was a dress code. My apologies if I've offended your sensibilities. His tone wasn't mocking, but there was a quiet confidence in his words that made Alina bristle. She turned back to her tablet, unwilling to continue the conversation. But as the hours passed, her curiosity about him grew despite herself. Who was this man? And why was he on this flight? At one point, Mr. Carter pulled out a slim laptop and began typing. Alina caught glimpses of graphs and charts on his screen, but she couldn't make sense of them. It wasn't until the flight attendant returned to offer him a drink that she overheard something that piqued her interest. "Thank you," he said to the attendant, "but I'll pass. I have a meeting as soon as we land, and I'd like to stay sharp." A meeting? Alina's curiosity deepened. If he were some low-level employee or minor entrepreneur, he wouldn't have been on this flight. The exclusivity of the airline ensured that only those with significant clout or wealth could book a seat. Yet he didn't carry himself like the typical power player she was used to. No ostentatious watch, no designer briefcase, no airs of entitlement. Despite her initial irritation, Alina found herself wanting to know more about him. But for now, she would remain silent, observing and waiting for the opportunity to uncover the mystery of Mr. Carter. Unbeknownst to her, the revelation of who he truly was would challenge everything she thought she knew about power, privilege, and humility. Clash of perspectives. The hours stretched on as the private jet soared above the clouds, cradled in an ethereal sea of white. Alina had managed to distract herself with work, her tablet glowing with a stream of emails and project proposals. Yet, every so often, her gaze drifted toward Mr. Carter. There was something about his unflappable calm that unsettled her, a quiet confidence that seemed out of place, at least in her estimation. She'd dealt with countless men like him before, or so she thought. Quiet, unassuming types who lacked the ambition to truly thrive in her world. The kind of men who settled for less while she clawed her way to the top. And yet there was something different about him. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As if sensing her scrutiny, Mr. Carter glanced up from his laptop. Their eyes met, and he gave her a polite nod. It was a small gesture, but it irritated her nonetheless. She looked away quickly, focusing on her screen. "Miss Parker," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. She stiffened, caught off guard by his directness. "Yes. I couldn't help but notice your company's logo on your tablet. Parker Developments, right?" She blinked, surprised. "Yes. Why?" He leaned back in his seat, his fingers laced together casually. "Your firm's been making waves in urban redevelopment lately. The West Haven project, in particular, is impressive. Mixed-use development, eco-friendly infrastructure, and a focus on affordable housing. Bold move." Alina frowned, her defensive instincts kicking in. "How do you know about the West Haven project?" "I keep tabs on impactful developments," he replied, his tone neutral. "It's rare to see a company of your size take a genuine interest in affordability. Most just focus on maximizing profits." His words hung in the air, carrying a subtle edge that Alina couldn't ignore. Was it a compliment or a veiled critique? She decided to respond with the confidence she was known for. "We're not just about profits," she said, sitting up straighter. "We're about leaving a legacy. Parker Developments doesn't cut corners. We set standards." Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smile. Interesting philosophy. The way he said it made her bristle. She didn't like being analyzed, especially not by someone who didn't even belong in her world. She folded her arms across her chest and turned the question back on him. "And what about you, Mr. Carter? What exactly do you do?" He paused, as if considering how much to reveal. "I'm in business." "That's vague," she shot back, her tone sharper than she intended. He chuckled softly. "It's accurate. I'm involved in a few ventures, mostly strategy and acquisitions." Her curiosity deepened despite herself. He spoke with the ease of someone who understood the high-stakes world of corporate maneuvering. but there was an air of mystery about him, as if he was deliberately holding something back. "Let me guess," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Tech startups. Or maybe you're one of those serial entrepreneurs who claims to disrupt industries." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that caught her off guard. "Not quite, but I'll take it as a compliment." She rolled her eyes and returned to her tablet, determined to ignore him. But the tension between them lingered, an invisible thread pulling them into conversation despite her best efforts to avoid it. The flight attendant returned with another round of drinks, offering Mr. Carter a glass of sparkling water, which he accepted with a polite nod. Elena couldn't help but notice how he treated the staff, with genuine respect and warmth. It was subtle, but it stood in stark contrast to her own curt demeanor. She dismissed the observation as irrelevant. "You seem awfully comfortable for someone traveling in a space that's meant to be exclusive," Elena remarked, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. He set his glass down and looked at her, his expression calm but focused. "Comfort doesn't come from exclusivity, Miss Parker. It comes from knowing who you are." The word struck a nerve, though she refused to show it. "And I suppose you think you've got it all figured out." "No one ever has it all figured out," he said. "But I've learned that respect and humility go a long way, no matter the setting." Elena smirked, shaking her head. "Humility? That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't build empires." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but it does sustain them." The simplicity of his statement threw her off balance. She was used to people trying to impress her, to prove their worth. But Mr. Carter wasn't playing that game. He didn't need to. As the flight continued, Elena's restlessness grew. She needed to feel in control, and this man, with his calm demeanor and cryptic answers, was disrupting her sense of order. Finally, she decided to confront him directly. "You clearly think you're very clever," she said, her voice sharp. "But let me make something clear. I've worked hard to get where I am. Nothing was handed to me. So forgive me if I don't take kindly to people who act like they don't belong." The cabin grew silent, her words cutting through the low hum of conversation around them. Mr. Carter didn't react immediately. He took a sip of his water, his gaze steady on hers. "I don't doubt you've worked hard, Miss Parker," he said finally. "But perhaps you should consider that belonging isn't about appearances or pedigree. It's about how you carry yourself." She opened her mouth to retort, but his words stopped her. For a moment, she felt exposed, as if he'd seen through the carefully constructed armor she wore every day. Before she could respond, the flight attendant approached again, her expression slightly nervous. "Mr. Carter, the captain has asked to speak with you. It's regarding the upcoming meeting." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Meeting? What meeting?" Mr. Carter stood, his movements unhurried. "Just a minor matter to attend to upon landing," he said, his tone dismissive. "Excuse me." As he walked toward the cockpit, Elena couldn't help but feel a mix of irritation and intrigue. Who was this man? And what kind of meeting could possibly warrant the captain's involvement? She resolved to find out. After all, she wasn't one to let mysteries go unsolved, especially when they involved someone who had the audacity to challenge her perspective. Revealing layers, Elena sat in her seat, eyes fixed on the cockpit door that had closed behind Mr. Carter. Her mind churned with speculation. Who was this man, really? His calm demeanor, his cryptic remarks, and now this mysterious meeting were all out of step with the unassuming image he presented. She hated not knowing. Knowledge was power, and in her world, power was everything. The flight attendant returned to offer Elena another glass of champagne, but she waved it off with an impatient hand. "What's this meeting about?" she asked, her tone clipped. The attendant hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "I'm not sure, Miss Parker. The captain simply requested Mr. Carter's presence. It's not unusual for high-profile passengers to communicate with the crew during private flights." Elena's frown deepened. "High profile, you say? What exactly is his profile?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that, ma'am," the attendant replied with a professional smile. But I assure you, all passengers on this flight are thoroughly vetted." The attendant's vague response only fueled Alina's irritation. Thoroughly vetted. That didn't explain why someone so casual, so seemingly ordinary, was being treated with such deference. She decided to let the matter drop for now, but resolved to dig deeper once they landed. She had connections, people who could get her answers. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Mr. Carter stood before the captain and first officer, both of whom greeted him with respectful nods. The captain extended a hand. "Mr. Carter, thank you for joining us," the captain said. "We've received the final clearance for your meeting upon landing. Everything has been arranged as per your specifications." "Excellent," Carter replied, his tone businesslike but warm. "I appreciate the effort." The captain hesitated, then added, "If there's anything else you need, please let us know. It's an honor to have you aboard." Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Captain. Just ensure we're on schedule. Timing is critical." As Carter returned to his seat, Alina tracked his movements with a sharp gaze. He didn't seem flustered or self-important, just composed, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he intended. It was maddening. The hours passed slowly. Alina tried to focus on work, but her thoughts kept circling back to Mr. Carter. Every so often, she glanced at him, hoping to catch a clue, a gesture, a word, anything that might unravel his mystery. But he gave her nothing. He worked quietly on his laptop, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. Finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, she decided to confront him directly. If he wasn't going to volunteer information, she would drag it out of him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the cabin, "I have to ask, what exactly is your line of work? You've been rather vague about it." He looked up from his journal, his dark eyes calm but sharp. "I'm involved in several industries," he replied, his tone polite but non-committal. "A bit of this, a bit of that." "That's not an answer," she said bluntly. He chuckled softly, setting his pen down. "It's the truth, though." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing. "Let me rephrase. What gives you the right to treat this flight like it's your personal office? The captain, the crew, they're practically bending over backward for you. Why?" There was a pause as he considered her question. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that made her momentarily forget her irritation. "Miss Parker," he said slowly, "let me ask you something. Do you always assume the worst about people you don't know?" The question caught her off guard. "Excuse me." He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "You've made a lot of assumptions about me since the moment you boarded this flight. You assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I wasn't on your level. And now you're assuming that I owe you an explanation for simply existing in the same space as you." Her cheeks flushed, but she refused to back down. "I'm not assuming anything. I'm simply asking for clarity." "No," he said, his tone still calm, but now edged with steel. "You're demanding it. And there's a difference." Alina sat back, crossing her arms over her chest. She didn't like being called out, especially not by someone she considered an enigma at best and a nuisance at worst. "Fine," she said after a moment. "You're right. I did make assumptions, but can you blame me? You don't exactly scream transparency." He laughed again, a sound that seemed to disarm everyone within earshot. "Fair enough. But transparency isn't always a luxury we can afford, at least, not right away." Alina's eyes narrowed. "And why is that?" "Because some things are more important than appearances," he said simply. "Sometimes it's about the work, the impact." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Alina found herself at a loss for a retort. Impact. The word resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. She prided herself on her company's projects, on the tangible results of her efforts. But was that the same as impact? Was it enough? The jet began its descent, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. announcing their imminent arrival. As the cabin prepared for landing, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that this flight had shifted something in her, a subtle but undeniable shift in perspective. She still didn't know who Mr. Carter was, but she couldn't deny that he had made her question things she hadn't questioned in years. As the wheels touched down and the jet taxied to a stop, Alina stole one last glance at him. He was calm as ever, gathering his things with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. But as the cabin doors opened and the passengers began to disembark, she noticed something that made her stop short. Outside the jet, a convoy of sleek black cars waited, their polished exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sun. Standing near the lead car was a group of sharply dressed individuals, their demeanor unmistakably professional. They were clearly waiting for someone important, and they were looking directly at Mr. Carter. Alina's stomach dropped as realization began to dawn. Whoever this man was, he was far more significant than she had assumed, far more powerful, far more impactful, and she had underestimated him completely. The weight of influence. As the other passengers began gathering their belongings, Alina remained seated, her mind racing. Outside, the sight of the convoy waiting for Mr. Carter sent a ripple through her confidence. For someone she had dismissed as unassuming, he commanded a presence that even she had to acknowledge now. Who is this man? She thought, gripping the armrest of her seat. And why didn't I see it sooner? She shook off her thoughts and stood, smoothing the creases of her blazer. She wasn't one to be intimidated, even by the unexpected. As she reached for her carry-on, she saw Mr. Carter standing a few feet away, talking quietly with the flight attendant. Their exchange seemed casual, but the deference in her posture spoke volumes. Alina strained to hear their conversation. "Thank you for your assistance," Mr. Carter was saying. "The crew did an excellent job. Please extend my gratitude to the captain." "Of course, Mr. Carter," the attendant replied, her tone respectful. Alina's curiosity flared again. Who on earth was he to thank the crew with such familiarity, as though they were working for him? Her questions would have to wait. As she stepped off the plane, the warm air of the tarmac hit her face. The convoy was even more impressive up close. Black SUVs with tinted windows were flanked by a smaller luxury sedan, likely bulletproof. Several men in tailored suits stood nearby, each with an earpiece discreetly tucked into one ear. To her astonishment, as Mr. Carter descended the steps of the plane, the men moved into action. One of them opened the sedan's door, while another greeted him with a respectful nod. Alina slowed her pace, pretending to adjust the strap of her bag so she could observe. "Everything is ready, sir," one of the men said. "The board is waiting." Mr. Carter nodded, his face impassive. "Good. Let's keep them waiting as little as possible." The man moved to open the car door for him, but Mr. Carter paused. Turning, he looked back at Alina, who had stopped just a few feet away. "Miss Parker," he called out. Her heart skipped, though she quickly masked her surprise. "Yes." He gestured toward the convoy. "Need a ride?" The question was disarming, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. She was used to being the one in control, the one who extended or withheld opportunities. The idea of someone else offering her anything felt foreign. "Thank you, but I have a car waiting," she said, regaining her composure. "Of course," he replied with a slight smile. "Safe travels, then." Without waiting for her response, he stepped into the car. The door closed behind him with a decisive thud, and the convoy pulled away, leaving Alina standing on the tarmac, her thoughts swirling. The drive to her hotel was unusually quiet. Alina stared out the window, replaying the day's events in her mind. She was rarely caught off guard, yet Mr. Carter had managed to unsettle her from the moment she boarded the flight. His calm confidence, his refusal to rise to her provocations, and now this convoy, the deference, the power, it didn't add up. When she reached her suite, she dropped her bag onto the couch and immediately opened her laptop. If he wasn't going to give her answers, she would find them herself. She typed his name, Elliot Carter, into the search bar, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The results were instantaneous, and what she found made her breath catch. Elliot Carter, the man behind the curtain. Dozens of articles, interviews, and reports filled her screen. Elliot Carter wasn't just a businessman. He was a titan. CEO and majority owner of Carter Holdings, a private conglomerate with interests in aviation, technology, energy, and real estate. The company's valuation was in the tens of billions, though its exact worth was difficult to pin down due to its private status. What struck Elena most was the emphasis on his philanthropic efforts. Carter Holdings was deeply invested in community development, renewable energy projects, and educational initiatives for underserved communities. He had personally funded scholarships for thousands of students and spearheaded urban renewal projects that rivaled anything Parker Developments had attempted. One article in particular caught her eye: The Reluctant Mogul, Elliot Carter on Power, Purpose, and the Responsibility of Wealth. She clicked on it, skimming through the lines of text. Power without purpose is meaningless, Carter was quoted as saying. Too often, people chase influence for its own sake, forgetting that the true measure of success is the impact you leave behind. For me, it's not about being the wealthiest or the most powerful. It's about doing the most good with what I have. Elena sat back, her heart pounding. The man she had dismissed as an inconvenience on a private flight wasn't just powerful. He was redefining what power looked like, and she had misjudged him entirely. The next day, Elena arrived at her meeting with an unfamiliar sense of unease. She was used to dominating boardrooms, her sharp wit and uncompromising standards setting her apart. But today, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of her depth. She had come to finalize a partnership with a prominent urban development group, but her mind kept drifting back to Elliot Carter. As she walked into the sleek conference room, her steps faltered. Sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by executives, was none other than Carter himself. He looked up, his expression unreadable, as their eyes met. "Miss Parker," he said, rising to his feet. What a surprise. She struggled to keep her composure. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't aware you were involved in this project." "I'm not just involved," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I'm the majority stakeholder." Her mind raced. This was his project. He owned the development group she had been courting for months. She felt the weight of her earlier assumptions crashing down on her. As the meeting began, Elena found herself in an unfamiliar position, not as the dominant force, but as someone who needed to prove herself. And for the first time, she realized that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about learning. And Elliot Carter, the man she had underestimated, was about to become her greatest lesson. A new reality. The air in the conference room felt electric, charged with unspoken tension. Elena sat at the long table, her mind racing as the weight of the situation sank in. Elliot Carter, the man she had dismissed so easily on the flight, was the controlling force behind the very project she was here to pitch. Worse yet, she wasn't just meeting him. She would have to impress him. Carter sat at the head of the table, an understated yet commanding presence. He didn't need to assert his authority. It was clear from the way the other executives deferred to him, leaning in when he spoke and nodding at his every suggestion. Yet his demeanor was relaxed, his tone measured and inclusive, as if he genuinely valued input from everyone around him. Elena forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to let her earlier missteps cloud her judgment. She'd come too far to let one man, no matter how influential, derail her plans. As the meeting commenced, Carter gestured to one of his executives to begin. A man in his 40s, sharp-suited and polished, stood and launched into a presentation about the urban development project they were spearheading, a massive redevelopment effort aimed at transforming an underprivileged neighborhood into a thriving, sustainable community. It was ambitious and meticulously planned, with a focus on affordable housing, green spaces, and small business incubators. Elena recognized elements of the proposal. Her own firm had drawn up similar plans for another city. But Carter's approach was on an entirely different scale, blending cutting-edge technology with community-driven initiatives. Where her firm had focused on profitability, his emphasized long-term societal impact. As the presentation continued, she found herself torn. On one hand, she couldn't help but admire the vision and scale of Carter's project. On the other, it forced her to confront the limitations of her own approach. For years, she had prided herself on her company's success, on its ability to deliver high-end developments that turned a profit. But now, in the face of Carter's vision, her work felt incomplete. When the executive finished, Carter turned to Elena, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice low and calm, "I believe you have a proposal to share." She hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. Rising to her feet, she connected her tablet to the projector and began her presentation. Her slides detailed Parker Development's plans for the neighborhood, a mix of residential and commercial spaces, eco-friendly designs, and streamlined costs. She spoke with her usual confidence, highlighting the strengths of her proposal, the efficiency of her team, the proven success of her firm, and the financial viability of her designs. Yet, as she moved through her slides, she felt Carter's eyes on her, and it unnerved her. He wasn't just listening. He was analyzing, assessing. When she finished, she returned to her seat, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. The room was silent for a moment before Carter spoke. "It's a solid proposal," he said, his tone thoughtful, efficient, profitable. "But I'm curious, how do you define success for this project, Miss Parker?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure of how to answer. "Success means delivering a project that meets the client's needs while generating a strong return on investment." Carter leaned back in his chair, studying her. "A reasonable answer. But let me ask you this. What do you believe the neighborhood's needs are?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Elena. She felt her pulse quicken. "Well, the community needs access to quality housing, jobs, and infrastructure. And do you believe your proposal addresses those needs in a way that creates lasting impact?" He pressed, his tone still calm but unrelenting. Elena hesitated. She hadn't expected to be put on the spot like this, especially not by someone like Carter. "Our proposal is designed to balance the needs of the community with the realities of the market. It's a sustainable plan." Carter nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see. And what happens if the market's priorities shift? If profitability competes with the community's well-being?" Her mind raced, searching for a response. "We adapt, of course. That's the nature of business." "And yet," Carter said, leaning forward slightly, "it's often the communities that suffer when adaptation becomes synonymous with compromise. Don't you think?" The words landed like a blow. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss. He wasn't just questioning her proposal, he was questioning the very foundation of her approach. The meeting continued, but Elena barely heard the remaining discussion. She was too caught up in her own thoughts, replaying Carter's words over and over. For years, she had operated on a simple principle: deliver results. It was a principle that had served her well, propelling her to the top of her field. But now, for the first time, she found herself questioning whether results were enough. As the meeting adjourned, Carter stood and addressed the room. "Thank you, everyone, for your input today. We have a lot to consider, and I'll be reviewing all proposals before making a final decision. For now, I'd like a word with Miss Parker." Elena's heart sank. She nodded stiffly, her professional mask firmly in place, and followed him into a smaller adjacent conference room. The room was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. Carter gestured for her to sit, taking a seat across from her. He rested his hands on the table, his expression calm but serious. "Miss Parker," he began, "you're clearly talented. Your firm has an impressive track record, and your proposal reflects that. But I couldn't help but notice something missing." She bristled. "Missing?" He nodded. "Purpose. Vision beyond the immediate. Your proposal focuses on delivering a product, not a legacy. That's fine for some projects, but this one is different. Alina frowned, leaning forward. Different how? This neighborhood isn't just a plot of land. It's a community, a living, breathing entity with history, struggles, and potential. If we focus solely on profitability, we risk losing what makes it unique. And once that's gone, no amount of success can replace it. His words struck a chord she hadn't expected. She wanted to argue, to defend her approach, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had been so focused on efficiency and returns that she had overlooked the bigger picture. "You're saying my approach isn't enough," she said quietly. "I'm saying it could be more," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "And I believe you're capable of that. You just need to see it for yourself." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Carter stood and extended a hand. "Thank you for your time, Miss Parker," he said. "I'll be in touch soon." Alina shook his hand, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As she left the room, she couldn't help but feel that her world had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in years, she didn't know what came next. Breaking the mold. Alina walked out of the conference building feeling uncharacteristically unsettled. She was used to having a clear direction, a plan of action that left no room for doubt. Yet, Elliot Carter's words echoed in her mind, cutting through her usual defenses. Purpose, vision beyond the immediate. It wasn't as if she didn't care about the communities her projects impacted. She just saw her work as a balancing act, giving enough to maintain a positive image while ensuring maximum returns for investors. It was how the game was played, and she played it to perfection for years. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that was enough. Back in her hotel room, Alina paced the plush carpet, her mind refusing to quiet. She opened her laptop and revisited Carter's background. Article after article painted a picture of a man who had defied convention at every turn. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, attending underfunded schools, and witnessing firsthand the struggles of communities left behind by progress. His education had been funded by scholarships and part-time jobs, and after earning his MBA, he had risen through the ranks of corporate America with startling speed. But Carter's story wasn't just about success. It was about transformation. Unlike many in his position, he hadn't sought to escape his roots. Instead, he had used his wealth and influence to uplift others, focusing on projects that balanced profitability with profound social impact. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a visionary. Alina closed her laptop, rubbing her temples. She hated feeling out of her depth, but that's exactly where Carter had placed her, somewhere between admiration and self-doubt. The next morning, Alina's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, Sarah. "Sarah. Good morning, Ms. Parker. Mr. Carter's office sent over an invitation. He'd like you to join him for a site visit this afternoon. Details attached." Alina frowned, her stomach tightening. A site visit? What game was he playing now? She opened the attachment, noting the location, an area near the edge of the city that was slated for redevelopment. A neighborhood she'd studied but never actually visited. For a moment, she considered declining. But something, curiosity, pride, or maybe even the faintest hint of shame, compelled her to accept. Hours later, Alina found herself in a part of the city she had only ever seen on maps. The streets were lined with aging row houses, many of them boarded up. Small businesses, some barely hanging on, dotted the area. Children played in cracked sidewalks, while older residents sat on porches, their eyes wary but watchful. Carter was already there, standing near a community garden that had seen better days. He wore a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, his demeanor as calm as ever. Beside him was a group of locals, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hope. "Alina," he greeted her as she approached. "Glad you could make it." She nodded, keeping her tone professional. "I wasn't sure what to expect." "Good," he said with a small smile. "That's the point." He turned to the group and introduced her briefly before addressing them directly. Miss Parker is considering partnering with us on this project. I wanted her to see what's at stake firsthand. The group nodded politely, though Alina could feel their skepticism. She couldn't blame them. She was just another developer to them, someone who might tear down their neighborhood to make way for high-rises and luxury stores. The tour began with Carter leading her through the community. He pointed out the areas his team had already started improving. A refurbished community center where children took after-school classes, a renovated park with new equipment, and a co-op grocery store run by locals. But there were still plenty of challenges: dilapidated buildings, empty lots, and a lack of basic infrastructure. As they walked, Carter introduced her to residents. There was Maria, who ran the co-op and talked about how it had given her a sense of purpose. David, a retired teacher who was mentoring at-risk youth, and Leela, a teenager whose scholarship for college had been funded by Carter's foundation. "You see, Miss Parker," Carter said as they paused near a basketball court, "this isn't just a project for me. It's personal. These people aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're lives. Futures." Alina felt a pang of guilt. She had always considered herself empathetic, but standing here, she realized how little she had truly engaged with the people her projects affected. At the end of the tour, Carter led her to a small cafe that doubled as a community hub. They sat at a corner table, the hum of conversations and laughter filling the space. A waiter brought over 2 cups of coffee, and Carter waited until the man left before speaking. "What did you think?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. "It's eye-opening," Alina admitted. "You've done incredible work here." "Thank you," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But there's still so much to do. And that's where you come in." She frowned slightly. "Me?" Carter nodded. "Your company has resources, talent, and reach. What it lacks, in my opinion, is a commitment to something larger than profit. You could change that, if you're willing." Alina hesitated, caught between defensiveness and intrigue. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said. "It's hard. Harder than you can imagine. But it's worth it." His words hung in the air, challenging her in a way few things ever had. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to make tough decisions, to take calculated risks. But this wasn't just a risk. It was a leap into unfamiliar territory. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly, voicing a fear she rarely admitted. Carter's gaze softened. "Failure's a part of growth, Alina. But the real failure is never trying. I'm not asking you to overhaul your entire company overnight. I'm asking you to start with one project. This project." She looked down at her coffee, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say no, to retreat to the safety of what she knew. But another part, the part she hadn't listened to in years, was telling her to take the chance. Finally, she met his gaze. "All right," she said. "Let's do this." Carter's face broke into a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard." For the first time in a long time, Alina felt something stir within her, a sense of purpose, of possibility. And as she left the cafe, she realized that this wasn't just a new chapter for her career. It was a new chapter for her life. Redefining success. The weeks following Alina's decision were a whirlwind of activity. Back at Parker Developments, her team was shocked by her sudden shift in priorities. Alina had always been laser-focused on profitability, demanding efficiency and results above all else. Now she was spearheading a project that seemed less about numbers and more about people, a concept that left her senior staff skeptical. Alina stood at the head of the conference table in her sleek corner office, addressing a room filled with top executives. Her tablet displayed the new project proposal, which outlined a partnership with Carter Holdings to revitalize the neighborhood she had toured. Unlike their usual projects, this one prioritized community engagement, affordable housing, and long-term sustainability over immediate returns. Her senior vice president, Mark Richards, frowned as he flipped through the documents. "Alina, I'm not sure I understand the angle here. This doesn't align with our standard model. The ROI is significantly lower, and the timeline for profitability is, frankly, unacceptable. Alina's gaze was steely, her tone unwavering. The angle, Mark, is impact. This isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about creating something that lasts, something that matters. Another executive, Laura Chen, raised an eyebrow. And how do we explain this to the board? They're not going to be thrilled about taking a hit to our margins for what's essentially a goodwill project. Alina leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. We explain it by showing them the bigger picture. This project isn't just about goodwill. It's about positioning Parker Developments as a leader in sustainable, community-driven development. This is the future, and if we don't adapt, we'll be left behind. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, Mark sighed and nodded. All right, but this is a gamble, Alina. Every decision we've ever made was a gamble, she shot back. The difference is, this time, the stakes are higher than profit. They're about people. The next phase of the project involved direct collaboration with Carter Holdings. For the first time, Alina found herself working alongside Carter, not as an adversary or a competitor, but as a partner. It was a dynamic she wasn't used to, sharing control, listening to ideas that weren't her own, and admitting when someone else's approach was better. Their planning sessions often stretched late into the night with blueprints, budgets, and community feedback spread across the conference table. Carter's leadership style was collaborative and patient, a stark contrast to Alina's more authoritative approach. Yet, she couldn't deny how effective it was. He had a way of drawing out the best ideas from everyone in the room, making each person feel heard and valued. One evening, as the office emptied out and the city lights sparkled outside the window, Carter leaned back in his chair, stretching. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through with this." Alina looked up from her laptop, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" He smiled, his expression teasing but not unkind. "You're used to playing it safe, even if you don't think you are. This is uncharted territory for you." She closed her laptop and folded her arms, leaning back in her chair. "Maybe, but I'm not afraid of uncharted territory. If I were, I wouldn't have built Parker Developments into what it is." "Fair point," he admitted. "But this isn't just about building something. It's about rebuilding, repairing trust, nurturing relationships, and creating something that isn't just profitable, but meaningful." His words struck a chord, and for a moment, Alina allowed herself to reflect. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked quietly. "Carrying all of this, the responsibility, the expectations." Carter's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Of course I do. But I remind myself why I'm doing it. It's not about me. It's about them." He gestured toward a stack of community surveys on the table. "Every decision we make affects real lives. That's a weight, yes, but it's also a privilege." Alina nodded slowly, his words sinking in. For years, her decisions had been driven by ambition, by the need to prove herself in a world that doubted her. But now, for the first time, she wondered if there was a different way, a better way. As the project moved into the implementation phase, Alina spent more time in the neighborhood than she ever thought she would. She attended community meetings, listened to residents' concerns, and even rolled up her sleeves to help with small tasks like painting walls or planting trees. It was a side of her that her colleagues had never seen before, a side she hadn't known existed. One afternoon, she found herself sitting on the steps of a community center, sharing a bottle of water with Maria, the co-op manager. The older woman smiled warmly at her. "You're different than I expected," Maria said. Alina raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what did you expect?" Maria chuckled. "Someone who cared more about buildings than people." Alina sighed, staring out at the children playing in the newly renovated park. "I used to be that person," she admitted. "Maybe I still am, a little, but I'm trying to change." Maria patted her hand. "Change is hard, but it's worth it. These people, They see you showing up. That means something." Alina smiled faintly, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Showing up. It was such a simple concept, yet it carried so much weight. As the months went by, the project began to take shape. The neighborhood transformed before her eyes. And so did Alina. She found herself redefining what success meant, not just in terms of the project, but in her own life. She still cared about results, but now she saw the faces behind the numbers, the lives her work touched. One day, as she walked through the neighborhood with Carter, he turned to her and said, "You've done good work here, Alina." She smiled, feeling a rare sense of pride. "We've done good work." He nodded, his expression serious. "This is just the beginning, you know. There's so much more to do." "I know," she said. And for the first time, she meant it, not as a challenge, but as a promise. As they stood together, watching the sun set over a neighborhood reborn, Alina realized that this project wasn't just about revitalizing the community. It was about revitalizing herself. And for that, she would always be grateful. Legacies and new beginnings. Months turned into a year, and the transformation of the neighborhood became a beacon of hope, not just for its residents but for Alina herself. She had thrown herself into the project, not out of obligation or necessity, but because something deeper had awakened in her, a desire to leave a mark beyond balance sheets and skyscrapers. The once dilapidated streets were now lined with vibrant murals, bustling small businesses, and families who walked with a renewed sense of pride. For the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the city had organized an event that drew media attention and local leaders. The large stage had been set up in the park, surrounded by a crowd of residents, journalists, and project stakeholders. Alina stood off to the side, her tailored suit immaculate as always, but there was a calmness to her presence that hadn't been there before. Elliot Carter approached her, his demeanor as effortlessly composed as ever. He was dressed more formally than usual, but his warm smile remained unchanged. "You ready for this?" he asked, nodding toward the stage. Alina chuckled softly. "I should be asking you that. You've done this more times than I have." "This one's different," he said, his tone carrying a quiet pride. "It's yours as much as it is mine." She hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. For so long, she had been chasing accolades, trying to prove herself in a world that demanded perfection. But this felt different. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about creating something meaningful. The ceremony began with speeches from local leaders and community members. Maria, the co-op manager, spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion as she thanked the teams who had poured their hearts into the project. She shared stories of how the renewed neighborhood had given her family hope and stability, how it had inspired her children to dream bigger. When it was Alina's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with measured steps, feeling the eyes of the crowd on her. For once, she wasn't nervous. Instead, she felt grounded, connected to something larger than herself. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "When I first came to this neighborhood, I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I understood what it meant to build something worthwhile. But I didn't. Not really." She paused, letting her words settle. This project wasn't just about redeveloping a neighborhood. It was about rebuilding trust, creating opportunities, and proving that people matter more than profit. And I can honestly say I've learned more from this community than I ever could have imagined. Her eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Maria, on David the retired teacher, and on Leela, who had just started her first semester of college. "To the residents of this neighborhood, thank you. Thank you for trusting us, for holding us accountable, and for reminding us why this work matters." The crowd erupted into applause as she stepped back from the podium. Alina felt a lump rise in her throat, but it wasn't from nerves. It was gratitude, a deep, unshakable gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and explored the newly inaugurated spaces, Carter found Alina near the community center. He handed her a cup of coffee, the same way he had during one of their first late-night planning sessions. "Quite the speech," he said, his tone teasing but genuine. "Not bad for someone who usually lets the results speak for themselves," she replied with a smirk. Carter laughed. "I think you've learned that results and people aren't mutually exclusive." She nodded, looking around at the vibrant scene before them. Children laughed as they ran across the playground. Shop owners greeted customers with smiles, and families gathered in the park. It was a stark contrast to the neighborhood she had first walked through, a testament to what could happen when purpose and vision aligned. "Thank you, Elliot," she said quietly, "for pushing me, for making me see things differently." He shrugged, his smile faint. "You had it in you all along. Sometimes it just takes a little nudge." She turned to him, her gaze steady. No, this was more than a nudge. This was transformative. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching the community they had worked so hard to rebuild. Then Carter turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "So," he said, "what's next for Parker Developments?" Elena smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "A lot of things, but one thing's certain. We're not going back to the way we used to do business. This project changed me, and it's going to change my company. I want to take what we've done here and replicate it. Not just in other neighborhoods, but in the way we approach every project. Purpose first." Carter nodded, his expression approving. "That's a legacy worth building." The next few months were a blur of activity. Elena restructured her company's mission, bringing in consultants and community leaders to advise on new strategies. She launched a division focused solely on socially conscious development, ensuring that every project had measurable impacts on the communities they served. It wasn't easy. The board pushed back, investors expressed skepticism, and some executives chose to leave. But Elena pressed on, buoyed by the lessons she had learned and the successes she had already seen. Slowly but surely, Parker Developments began to transform, not just as a company, but as a force for good. 1 year after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Elena returned to the neighborhood. This time, she came alone, dressed casually in jeans and a light jacket. She wandered through the streets, taking in the sights and sounds of a community that had found its rhythm. As she passed the co-op, Maria waved her over, offering her a cup of coffee and a warm smile. "Back to check on us." Elena laughed. "Something like that. I wanted to see how everything's going." "Better than ever," Maria said. "And it's thanks to you, to both of you." Elena shook her head. "No, it's thanks to this community. We just gave you the tools. You did the rest." Maria beamed, and for the first time, Elena felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. This wasn't just a project. It was a partnership, a shared dream brought to life. As she walked back to her car, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent so much of her life chasing success, only to discover that true fulfillment came not from taking, but from giving. And as she drove away, she knew this was only the beginning.